Okay, so first of all, the consequence of Adichie having only a single story about that family was that she had created a stereotype of that family in her head, and that when she did eventually go and meet Fide's family, she was actually ashamed and surprised by the fact that that stereotype had been so reductive and not necessarily untrue because the family was poor, but reductive to poverty as their only characteristic, that she had blocked herself from believing or thinking or imagining that there could be more to Fide's family than simply poverty. And so, what could have happened differently is that if she had not stood by this single story and she had had access to different stories or a variety and balance in stories, she would have understood better that while Fide's family was poor, they were also hardworking and talented and creative. And so that understanding would have reflected in her lack of surprise when she met the family, in the realization that there were not only poor but also many other positive aspects. And it would have reflected in the fact that she would not have had this reductionist mentality when meeting Fide's family. So, according to Adichie, the synonym for Mexicans in America is the typical immigrant. And I think that immigrants are a really big part of Mexico's identity. I do believe that immigration is something that is in our mouths in our day to day. It's something that we discuss. It's something that represents, I think it represents a structural problem with Mexico's government and state. And I think that immigration is important for several reasons. Not only because it's something that affects us all, but because it's also something that is a continuous effort, not only in fixing the structural damage that creates immigration, but also in the revenues that immigration from creates towards the structure. So like immigration generates a lot of money from Mexicans, and it's really important because they do have access to perhaps different opportunities. No, I wouldn't say necessarily better, but maybe different opportunities. And I think that because it's something that has been so ingrained in us, this immigration, it has become an integral part of the Mexican identity. And so she was obviously surprised when she was walking in Guadalajara because she saw that Mexicans were so much more than this story that she had been sold, where they were just immigrants and criminals crossing the border to steal American jobs. And I think that she noticed that Mexicans are people, and as people, they are complex. And while they have negative aspects of their identity, they also have this beautiful, colorful world of positive aspects of their identity. And I think it's a lot about what the video was saying about how these reductionist single story narratives do not allow us to fully see people as human beings, because they only allow us to see the negative parts of them and disregard the complexity that human beings have. And I think that is exactly the danger of a single story about Mexicans, is that the main danger is that there's many people that buy into this single story, that do not comprehend that Mexicans, especially Mexican immigrants, are still people who have this rich, complex identity, and they are so much more than the act of immigration. Mexicans in general are so much more than immigrants, but also immigrants are so much more than just the fact that they immigrated. And I think that it's very dangerous because it allows the justification of negative conduct towards Mexican immigrants and Mexicans in general from the standing point that you do not see them as humans, and I think that's really dangerous. So, a single story that I believed in is that probably I also believe that there was less educated people in Africa. I think that I am guilty of having thought of Africa as a whole rather than understanding that there's many different nations within that with different cultures and different identity. And the single story where you see an African person as less educated, or or being part of like a really traditional tribe, without regarding the fact that they also have a lot of very modern aspects to them. And did you have that single story to a cultural expression? Yes. I think that the reason I knew this single story was because it is a single story of Africans that was presented to me through TV and series. And I think that it's just always like the same storyline where there is like this helpless African person and they get help from like this white person. And I think that's really reductionist and really wrong. And I am grateful to have been able to open my mind and to have had this balance of stories that allowed me to see past just the part that I had been exposed to when I was younger. And I think as a Mexican woman, I have indeed been related to a single story. So I think that people are, for example, really surprised when they see me and they find out that I'm Mexican. And I think that that's because people just assume the Mexicans have a really specific physical look. And I think that a lot of people are like, "No way, you're Mexican." And I'm so proud to be Mexican, and it upsets me when people are like, "You don't look Mexican." Because how can you define looking Mexican? So to me, it's really crazy that the only kind of exposure they've had to Mexican people is like this stereotyped person that is sitting on a nopal wearing a ranchero hat. And while there are Mexicans that are living that situation, I think it's really reductionist to assume that all Mexicans look like that. And I think it robs me personally of being representative of that identity when people just do not assume that I am related to that identity. And I think that's really reductionist and terrible. So, what could be the downsides of believing in single stories? I think the main downside of believing in single stories is the justification of negative behaviors from a reductionist point of view about someone. I think that a lot of damage is done not only to people personally, but also violence is created when you do not have the ability to see past the stereotypes. Because I think that exposure is really important. I think that a lot of people are only ever exposed to a single story about different groups of people, and I do think that that is has the inevitable downside of being inherently violent. And I think that is really sad, and that is really like a downside, that is that not it doesn't allow you to fully understand that these people are also wonderful and complex and have so much to apport to other kinds of subjects and and themes. And I think that it's really reductionist and really sad that we disregard them because of a single story. And finally, I think that this balance of story means exposures to the different types of stories, the good and the bad, that allows us to understand a group of people as human beings that are complex and multi layered, and that they have bad aspects of their identity, but also really positive one. And it's like, how can it's helpful because it allows us to be more inclusive, because it allows us to be more peaceful through understanding that they are also human beings like us, and that while we do not share identity, there's like a lot of things that we do have in common, and that peace can exist, and that they are just as human as us. And we can find this through like a more diverse exposure. I think that having more diversity in literatures and music and series and TV helps us understand different points of views, the good and the bad, and it just shows that everyone around the world is still a human being. They deserve peace and they deserve our understanding. Thank you.